I recently played and finished the story of 007 First Light, and I did dabble a little bit in the tax sim stuff, but haven't really done much there. But I just wanted to give my first impressions, my initial thoughts, and sort of review the game just from the perspective of the story mode, and then talk about whether or not I'm going to continue playing the game and specifically kind of what I want out of the game moving forward. I've been really looking forward to 007 First Light for a long time, basically ever since it was announced that IO Interactive was making a 007 game. I've been super excited because I'm a massive fan of the Hitman World of Assassination trilogy that IO Interactive made. Um, Easily some of my favorite games ever made, and I've put hundreds of hours into the Hitman trilogy, the modern Hitman trilogy, and just seeing that gameplay style replicated in the setting of a 007 game sounded like a match made in heaven. And it was so obvious and clear to me that this was a perfect fit. And so I've been really looking forward to this game for a long time because I thought that just translating the style of gameplay from Hitman into a 007 game was going to be super simple. Um, so my review of the game really does come from the perspective of someone that loves Hitman. And I think that has changed my perception of the game in a way that maybe someone who's never played the Hitman games wouldn't necessarily have. There's definitely some bias from my perspective, having spent so much time with the Hitman trilogy going into this game. And at first, when I was thinking about this game, I thought about just, trying to review it on its own merits. And in some ways, I think the game deserves that perspective and that type of review because it isn't a Hitman game. And so you have to sort of separate Hitman from this game in terms of, what the gameplay is. But at the same time, it's pretty clear that it wears its inspiration on its sleeve. And so you cannot help but compare 007 to Hitman. And I think that those comparisons are valid. And as someone who has spent a lot of time with the Hitman games, it allows me to sort of point out the things that I think 007 could be doing differently and the things that I think it does better than Hitman, because there are things that I think that it does better. Um, but just know that my review of this game comes from that perspective of a super fan of the World of Assassination trilogy. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and start from the beginning. When you boot up the game, it pretty much only gives you one option, which is to earn the number. It drops you right into the story mode. Um, Hitman, when you boot it up, has kind of a dense menu with lots of different uh, game modes and options and things. And it's pretty open ended right from the start. I mean, obviously, with Hitman, you're going to start in the training missions and you're going to work your way through. But pretty much once you're out of the Cuba training missions in Hitman 1, the game really opens up to the point where you can pretty much like just go through the menus and do everything that you want to do. 007 really encourages you and in fact gates a lot of things from you. um it really encourages you to finish the story first. It clearly wants you to just do the single player linear story, and then everything else is just tangential to that. Whereas I think with Hitman, the sandbox is the game and the story is second. And with 007, it's directly the opposite. The story comes first, and then the sandbox stuff comes later and is tangential to the story. And so for that reason, there's like an instant difference. You can feel the difference right away when you're playing these two games. And so, from the perspective of reviewing the game, I think it's fair to make that comparison, but then judge 007 on the strength of what it is advertising to you, which is its story mode. And that's the majority of the time that I've spent in the game. Like I said, I've done very little of the tax sim stuff so far. I'd like to play more of it, but right now, I mostly have played the story, which took me about like 16 hours to finish. And so I'm going to basically review the game from the perspective of having played the story mode, and we're going to go from there, basically. And I think that's a fair way to do it at the beginning before I start making comparisons, because that's how IO wants you to play the game. It wants you to play the story mode and really engage with that. And then if you want to do more, there's more for you. But essentially, this is a single player linear story game. Um, Obviously, I've spent a lot of time comparing the game to Hitman at this point, but there's other comparisons that are pretty obvious and easy to make as well. The first of which, obviously, is Uncharted. This game is so Uncharted coded that it sometimes feels like a blatant ripoff. Um, there's a section pretty early in the game where, and they've shown this off in gameplay trailers and stuff, so it really isn't a spoiler. Um, where you sort of end up on this airfield and then you board this plane and then you sort of fight your way through the plane and then you fall out of the back of the plane and have to like get a parachute from a guy and blah blah blah. Anyway, it all feels very much like Uncharted 3. Um, there's like a section straight up in like a desert area that feels ripped straight out of Uncharted 4. There's just a lot of Uncharted inspiration here. The set pieces really feel like they're inspired by that game and games of its ilk. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The set pieces in this game are pretty awesome, generally speaking. But there's just a lot of Uncharted coding here. Um, Hitman has like a little bit of the sort of, scaling pipes and climbing on ledges and stuff, but it's very stiff, intentionally so. This game really leans into that sort of Uncharted style platforming in some sections, which is kind of interesting. And the gunplay in this game is much more action oriented than the sort of tactical style of Hitman. And so that leans more into the Uncharted realm as well. Um, but from a story perspective, it really feels like an Uncharted game where you're going from, chapter to chapter, set piece to set piece, and then you have some downtime for like story stuff, where you get to like meet the characters and do some dialogue and things, and then it's back to another mission and then a set piece and so on. So it just has sort of that same cadence of like one of those single player action adventure games a la Uncharted. The story itself is actually quite good. I would say my favorite thing about the game at this point in time is its presentation and the story and the characters and the voice acting and all of that. I think IO really wanted to flex those muscles with this game in a way that they aren't really able to with Hitman, just due to the limitations of the Hitman formula. And they've sort of bucked those limitations in an effort to create a better, more story driven adventure here. But it still tries to be Hitman sometimes to its benefit, sometimes to its detriment. But I think the main draw of this game is that it's a 007 game and that it's got a really cool, interesting 007 story with great characters and great acting and stuff like that. Bond himself as a character is, sort of this prototypical brash young, um, up and coming, trying to earn his place in MI6 trying to earn the number young double O that um, is reckless and immature and so on, which is very on brand, and so that totally makes sense. And the actor that plays Bond does a great job, and I think the character design is perfect for this game. He's very young, he looks very young, and that plays to the place that he fits in the story, which is as this sort of immature, brash, um, sort of cocky character. And then a lot of the side characters are great too. There's obviously the ones that we're pretty familiar with. The Money Penny in this game feels very close to the Money Penny that we've seen in Bond films up to this point. Um, Q is very much the traditional Q, that the older Q, not so much the younger one from the Craig game or the Craig movies, but really sort of the older, wiser, gadget tech guy, sort of like the John Cleese style Q. And then M is really the only character that is, quite different in that she is very new to MI6 in this game, and she like just got promoted into this position. And so I feel like a lot of the time when you see M in the Bond movies, she's sort of the older, grizzled MI6 veteran who is very much by the book and wants to sort of keep Bond in line and plays sort of a foil in that way. But in this game, M is very young and very fresh and is mostly concerned with the image of MI6 and um, the success of the agency. And so it kind of plays a little bit differently, which I appreciated actually because um, it feels like a different take on the character, and her investment in certain things is maybe different than what you would expect. And the actor that plays M is really quite good. And then the standout character of this game is John Greenway, who is sort of this mentor figure for Bond. Is sort of it's his trainer during his initial double O training, and then ends up being this sort of mentor slash sidekick character throughout a good chunk of the game. And he's really, I think, the standout character. A lot of the game's story revolves around him and his past with another agent, and the actor that plays him just does an excellent job. There's a lot of tension around Greenway and his opinion of Bond and how they work together and his motivations and whether or not he's going to step up and all this stuff. He really is, I think, the most complex character and the one that I had the most um, interest in over the course of the game's story. And there's other characters as well, like the fellow recruits that are training with Bond, um, that get some time in the spotlight, especially early on in the story. And then the villain characters as well, which I won't spoil, but there are a couple of villains in the game as well. And all of these are really quite good. I think really the only drawbacks from a character perspective that I would say are that the villains could use a little bit more work. They kind of play off as these stereotypical, um, just smarmy kind of virtuoso, holier than thou villains, which I mean, it's very on brand for Bond, but it's also just not that interesting. I think the game really leans into Greenway being the interesting character, and then everything else is sort of happening around him. And so that kind of makes the villains have a little bit less impact, um, especially once you get to the later portions of the game. There's almost an element of like, um, this is going to sound like a weird comparison, but if you get to the point in the game where you see how the villains develop, you'll get kind of what I'm saying. There's almost an element of like Troy Baker from Death Stranding to it, and the actor and the writers really try to ham up this villain character in it. to for better or worse. I mean, it's not bad by any means, but it's certainly not the most memorable part of the game. Um, that kind of brings me to like the pacing of the game. Like I said, it took me about 16 hours to get through the story, depending on how quickly you play it and how much you want to do. There, it could be a little bit shorter, a little bit longer. Um, but I think the pacing of the game is kind of all over the place. It sometimes feels very brisk and really quite good. I'd say like the middle portion of the game from about 3 hours in, 3 or 4 hours in to about 12 hours in is excellent. And that's really where the game feels the most like the combination of Hitman and Uncharted that it's going for. And I think it plays that very well in the middle of the game. But the opening of the game and the end of the game have some pacing issues for sure. Um, the opening of the game is quite long, it feels, and you don't really get into like a proper open mission for a good chunk of time. Um, and I kind of, I mean, when you go from Hitman, where you're kind of thrown right into this sandbox style gameplay very quickly, even the training missions are very sandboxy in Hitman. That is not how 007 is. It really takes its time to establish the characters and to get everything on the ground first and to build the foundation before you're thrust into an open situation. And even your first sort of open situation where you're in this club, this bar, is pretty small and contained. You don't really get your first big open mission where you have multiple routes through it until like probably 4 or 5 hours into the game. And so if you're willing to put up with that slow burn at the beginning, there's really great gameplay. Um, Once you get to that point, but up until then, it does take a little bit to get you there. That's not to say that the opening is bad necessarily. In fact, there's portions of the introduction of this game that are really quite stellar. I think obviously, like I said, the cutscenes and the fidelity are are quite good. The story is really good. That initial um, sequence where Bond is the lone survivor stranded on this island recovering an asset is really an excellent way to introduce the character and to introduce how he fits into um, this MI6 and it sort of introduces the core mystery of the game and so on. That part's really good. Again, the sort of meeting all of the characters is fun and everybody kind of gets their moment of introduction. Um, and there's this really great tutorial section where Bond is doing basic training where a lesser game would have sort of thrown you into these really rigid tutorials with lots of menus and lots of loading screens and all this. But 007 does this really interesting thing where you actually play through a training montage, which when I was playing the game, I mentioned to my friend, I've never seen a game do this before. Like it's very seamless. Like it just cuts from one thing to the next thing, and you're doing the tutorial as you're playing through this montage. It's really excellent, and I think they absolutely nailed that portion of the beginning of the game. Um, and then you sort of break it down into a little bit more of a rigid tutorial right after that. But there is this section where you're doing this training montage that felt very cool, and I will remember that part of the game vividly for a long time just because it was so unique. Um, so then, yeah, you get the story set up. They establish all the characters. You do your tutorials and your training and stuff, and then it sort of trickles you these other mechanics. Eventually, you get access to some gadgets. Eventually, you get access to your Q watch and stuff like that. But it takes a little bit, and so there's definitely there's some slow pace at the beginning, but the game really opens up about 4 or 5 hours in when you get to your first really big open mission that feels like Hitman. And I remember saying when I was playing the game, now we're playing Hitman. Like it really felt like when I started the mission. Okay, this feels like what the game is supposed to be. Like this is what I was promised when the Hitman developers were going to make a Bond game. And I think overall they did a pretty great job with the few missions that there are in the game that are like that. I'd say there's probably, I want to say 5, maybe 6 missions in the game that are that Hitman style, which is about what you would get out of a mainline Hitman game anyway. So from a content perspective, that felt like the appropriate amount. And then the rest of the game outside of those 5 or 6 missions is very linear and story based and so on. But this, these big open missions felt very cool the first time I played through them, because you do get this sense playing through them the first time that you have options and that there's this sense of scale, and you can kind of play around with it and do things your own way. And there's all these mechanics that you can implement to get yourself in and out of situations, and it feels very cool when you're first doing it. And you may sense apprehension in my voice as I'm talking about this, but it feels cool at the beginning. And when you're going through it the first time, it really is quite exciting to play through these missions. But if you play them a second time, you start to see the cracks, and you start to see that the game, as much as it advertises this openness in how you approach these missions, it really isn't that open. Certainly not to the extent that a Hitman game is. Every Hitman map really is a sandbox. Like, you can do so many things, and you can approach the game in so many different ways. And all ways are valid in Hitman. It really feels like a playground where you get to experiment and do different things, and there's all these different idiosyncrasies in the maps that you can discover. And it's very much a game about exploring and finding opportunities and breaking the game and doing weird stuff. Like, Hitman encourages you to be very creative and weird. And Hitman gives you many, many more tools than 007 does. Uh, 007, as much as it feels like a Hitman game at some points, when you go back and you look at it a little bit more and you play through these missions again, you start to realize that it really isn't as open as you thought. It feels more like a flowchart than a sandbox, is the best way I can describe it. So you start the mission, you really only have 2 or 3 options as far as your loadout goes. You're not really given that many different tools. There's about 6 different gadgets in the Q watch, and only a couple of them are available to you at most points in the game. Sometimes it just gives you certain ones because you have to have certain ones in order to proceed through portions of the game. And so it's it's not as open as you might think. You're not like loading up a mission like you are in Hitman, where you're creating this loadout and starting in a different location, and you have all these different disguises, and you have like all these different opportunities for how you're going to take out your targets and stuff like that. That's really not what 007 is. It's really, like I said, it's more like a flowchart. Imagine that you start at the beginning of the mission. You've got a couple different options for how you can proceed through the next portion of the mission, and those may open up into a couple more options, but then eventually it all starts to funnel back into the scripted ending of the mission. And then you end up exactly where everyone else ends up, because the story has to proceed the way that it's going to proceed, and there are set pieces that the developers want you to get to and to see. So as much as it is fun to experiment with some of the different mini stories within these missions, they really aren't that interesting, and they're really not that much different than each other, and they really don't give you the ability to have a huge amount of freedom when it comes to when it comes to how you approach the missions, like it would in Hitman. It's much more like a game like Uncharted, for example. I mean, there are sections of Uncharted that are open, um, and you sort of, you can take two or three different paths to get where you want to go. That's more what it feels like than a Hitman game. And I think that's a limitation of the game within the context of its story mode. I think the game has the foundation and the template by which you could create these sort of bigger, more open missions. You could create more of a Hitman style game here. The fundamentals are there, but within the context of the story mode, which is the main focus of this game, that's really not what you're coming in to the game for, and it's not what you're doing. You're not playing a Hitman game. You're playing more of a story-driven action adventure game with a few open options within certain missions. That's really how the game plays. Now, once you get to the tax sim stuff, which is the sort of extra mode that is separate from the story mode, and you can play. It has its own progression, and it's kind of its own. It's like AR training, basically. Imagine like AR training from like Metal Gear Solid or something like that. Um, that has a little bit more of the sort of Hitman freedom in it, and there's some kind of more open maps that give you different options, and there's different challenges that the game gives you to like tackle missions in specific ways, as a pacifist or as a little bit more aggressive or stealthy, or using only certain types of gadgets, or using only certain things, or accomplishing certain weird goals within the missions. But even then, it doesn't feel like the sort of gleeful play that Hitman gives you. There's really not this sense of openness and freedom in how you approach things as you get in the Hitman trilogy. And again, that's not necessarily a fault of this game. It's just something you need to be aware of if you're going into the game as someone who loves Hitman and was excited for this game because it was going to be a Bond game with the Hitman DNA in it. But I think what we got in the story mode is really quite good. I'll get kind of more towards the end without spoilers here, as far as the story mode is concerned in a second. But I think overall, as a single player action adventure, story driven game, this game is really high quality. It's quite good. It's easily an 8 out of 10 video game from that perspective. And I think if for the average person, because Hitman is semi niche. I mean, people know of it, obviously, but Hitman's audience certainly is not as wide as 007. And so I think this game is going to sell better than Hitman, and people are going to go into it with a different perspective than they go into a game, or than they would go into the game if they had a Hitman background, like I do. And so for the layman, I think this game is really excellent. I think it's really like the evolution of Uncharted into the sort of modern era. It sort of scratches that itch. And I think people will really enjoy it. And I mean, I really enjoyed it from that perspective. So I think it's definitely worth playing. Even though there are, like I said, there's some pacing stuff, there's some weaknesses in the story. I think the end, it draws on for a little too long. There's definitely this sense like, okay, I've seen all of this before. Like the game's not really showing me much new. Like, let's just get to the next thing. That it definitely drags near the end, and the villains are okay, but less than amazing. They're not super interesting. Their motivations are tacit at best. So, I mean, there are issues with the game for sure, but I think as a first crack at this style of game from IO, I think it's really really good. easily like a above average to great game. What I am hoping for and what I believe will happen with this game is that as support for the game goes on, because it is selling very well and people are playing it, I am hoping that IO invests a lot more into the tax sim portion of the game and gives us a lot more of those open-ended missions that let you play with the mechanics of the game a little bit more, because I think the game has such a great foundation as far as the gameplay goes, and we'll get more into the specifics of gameplay in a second, but I think the game has such a great foundation from a gameplay perspective that you really could make an excellent open playground sort of style game out of this. It's just that they haven't done that. And maybe it's because they needed to get their foot out or foot in the door first and like get the story out there and get people invested in the game and get copies out to people before they had the ability to go all in on the the Hitman style gameplay that people like me are searching for. And maybe it won't happen. Maybe they are happy with the game as it is, and we're not going to get too much of that, and we'll just get a sequel, because they're definitely, I mean, they are 100% confirmed doing a sequel. So we're gonna get more of this, and hopefully they will learn some of the lessons from this game, as they move on into the future of the series. But I will say I am excited to see where they go with this, and I think that they have so much room to grow, and the foundation is so good that I really think that we're in for a cool future with 007. I don't know if we'll get as much support for the game as Hitman has gotten. Um, I mean, post Hitman 3, there was so much content for that game that was provided. From game modes to maps to escalations and celebrity tie-ins and elusive targets and all this stuff. There was so much to do in Hitman 3, and that's I don't know if we're going to get that necessarily with this game. I think, for example, it's a lot more difficult to do those celebrity tie-ins and that kind of thing in a Bond game, just because it's its own self-contained thing. Bond is its own universe and doesn't really have the ability to expand out of that as much as Hitman does. Hitman doesn't really care. Hitman can do whatever it wants. It's Hitman doesn't have the internal logic that Double 007 has, the universe of Double 007 has. So, and there are things that you can't do necessarily, I'm sure, because of like licensing and stuff like that. So, um, but I do hope we get more support for the game. I hope that they drop more of these like kind of open missions and stuff like that. I'm gonna spend a little bit more time in the tax sim, and I'm gonna go back and replay some of the story missions and hunt challenges and stuff like that, and just see if my perspective on the game changes. But I think right now I have a pretty solid idea of my opinion of the game, and really what I think it comes down to is here's my summary at the end of this. Um, Before we get into, well, I want to talk about the specific gameplay, but here's my basic summary for everything I've said so far. From a single player story mode perspective, this game is great. It has a really cool premise, great characters, a fun story. It's pretty brisk through most of the middle of the game. It has some great set pieces. The acting is wonderful. The writing's good. I think it's a fun game, and I had a good time with it. I mean, I did it in like 3 sittings. I had a hard time putting it down. It was good. I would say from that, if you're looking at the game as just that, just like a story driven action adventure game, it's like an 8 out of 10 game. I think it's good, and you should probably play it. Maybe wait for a sale if you're not sure, but it's good. It's definitely worth playing. I'm sure it will go on deep sale, um, you know, in a year or two when they announce whatever they're going to be doing for the sequel. Because now that the foundation is set, the sequel will be much more quick to develop than this game was. So I would not be surprised if we got a sequel in 2 to 3 years from now, just because the foundation is there. And they could even do what Hitman has done, which Hitman 1 through 3 have all been consolidated into this one game, basically, Hitman World of Assassination, where it's a client that you open basically, and you have access to everything from all three of those games within that one client. And they could very well do the same thing here with 007. They could just continue the game and kind of just add more to the game as it is right now. And I think that would be fine if they did that. I think it makes sense to do that. They already have the knowledge and the wherewithal for how to make that work. So it would certainly be within IO's wheelhouse to do something like that. Or if they want, they can, try to keep it more separate and say, this is the story of this game. Here's another game with a new story. And they can do more of the Bond style thing where each Bond movie is really its own self-contained story. Outside of a few exceptions, specifically the end of the Daniel Craig era. But if they want to make just sort of a more episodic Bond experience, they can definitely separate them into separate games and so on. But we'll see what they do. I do want to briefly, before I give my final thoughts on the game, talk about the gameplay itself, because I did have some issues with the actual mechanics of the game. And there were also some things that I thought were just like mind-blowingly excellent about the game. So let's talk about the negatives first, and then we'll talk about the positives. So the negatives, I would say, are the melee combat specifically feels very, very bad a lot of the time. I don't know what it is about it. It might be like the way that you're locked into certain animations, or it might be the controls, because I definitely fought with the controls a little bit. It might be that the game doesn't really explain melee combat to you very well in the story mode. Like, I learned way more about the melee combat from the tech sim stuff than I did within the game's story, which is kind of weird. Like, you kind of need some of this information anyway. The melee combat is not great a lot of the time, especially when there's multiple opponents. It's kind of a nightmare. One opponent, not so bad, as long as you're kind of keeping track of what the opponent is doing. You can get around some of the clunkiness of it. But yeah, when you're surrounded, I mean, it is impossible to make sense of where things are and how you're supposed to be reacting. A good comparison that I would make is like the Batman Arkham games, where in those games, the melee combat feels very like fluid, and there's really good responsiveness, and it just feels great. Like the inputs that you're putting into the controller feel like they're happening on screen, and there doesn't feel like there's this weird delay or these weird buffers that you can't control, and the camera is better, so you have a wider angle and you can kind of see more of what's going on, and you're never at the mercy of the game's mechanics. You're at the mercy of your own skill level. Whereas in 007, you really, a lot of the time, you feel like you're just fighting against the game itself in melee combat, which, I mean, that's my main problem with the game. And you're forced into it a lot of the time is another problem. There are literally portions of the story that you cannot get around where you have to do melee combat, and the mechanics of it are just not great. Now, with that being said, visually, the melee combat looks incredible. I mean, there are some jaw-dropping animations in this game. Like, there are things that Bond does with opponents and the environment in this game that I actually don't
understand how they did it. Like it's mind-boggling. The way that the environment responds to uh, your combat with NPCs and how you can use different parts of the environment as part of the part of your melee combat, part of the combos, the way that you can use different parts of the environment with your gadgets and stuff in combat is unbelievable. It's so cool. I mean, it's really excellent. But it's soured by the fact that sometimes it feels very clunky. The controls are weird. Sometimes Bond does stuff that it doesn't feel like he should do, or you get kind of locked into cover somewhere, or you get locked into a you know combat with one enemy when you meant to be targeting another enemy. That kind of stuff happens, but the game looks so great and it's so cinematic, and the combat is so, I mean, I cannot express how instrumental the environment is to combat and how much it responds to your to you within the game. It's really hard to explain, but like, I mean, the fact that there are these like bespoke animations for seemingly every single tiny piece of the environment in combat is crazy. And I think maybe they spent too much time on that portion of the combat and making it look cool, and like adding all of these animations into every single microparticle of the game, that they couldn't do that and also have like a really mechanically tight combat system. And so they're sacrificing some of that, like really, you know, te- uh, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but they're sacrificing the fluidity and the simplicity and the mechanical um, accuracy of the combat for the visual spectacle of the combat. And to be fair, I mean the game is gorgeous, and like I said, the way that some of these combat scenarios play out within the environment is unbelievable. Um, and the gunplay is great, I will say. Melee combat doesn't feel amazing, but the gunplay is great. The problem is that there's only portions of the game where you're allowed to actually get into firefights. And there are other portions of the game where even if you engage with hostiles, even if you are spotted in a stealth situation, they don't open fire on you. And so you're stuck in melee combat because you don't have license to kill, is the way that the game justifies this mechanically. But you don't have license to kill, so you can't pull out a gun. But man, some of these sections would feel so much better if you could just whip out a silenced pistol and go to town. Like, this is another thing where Hitman is very different from 007 in that Hitman has you have the ability to go into any mission with as many guns as you want and just go to town, guns blazing. But Hitman's obviously a very different game tonally from 007, and Bond doesn't necessarily have like the ability to just go on a killing spree. So you have to wait for the opponents to shoot at you before you can shoot back. But that creates a lot of problems with some of the mission design, in that sometimes you're just like, I want a gun so bad. Um, and you can't use one. And especially early on in the story, you don't have access to any silenced weaponry. So the moment you pull out a gun and fire it at someone, you are spotted. There's nothing you can do about it. And so that can feel sometimes really bad. The game really wants you to lean into the gadgets system for the stealth, but that has its own set of problems. Instead of in Hitman, the gadgets themselves are mechanically diverse. In 007, you have like two or three gadgets total, and the environment is supposed to be the diverse part. So you're supposed to use the gadgets in different ways with different portions of the environment to get different results. Whereas in a Hitman, you load up a loadout of all of these different gadgets and things, and they all do very bespoke different things. Whereas, yeah, 007, you have like a laser, a dart, and a watch. And you just have to figure out how those things are going to affect the environment. And sometimes they affect the environment in ways you don't expect. Sometimes they affect the environment in ways that aren't helpful to you. Sometimes you go into a situation where you're not supposed to use lethal force, you don't have license to kill, but then you can shoot a missile at a guy, and that's apparently fine. You can, like, poison a guy and eliminate him, and that's apparently fine. It's very strange. But once you get into a firefight, oh man, the game feels great. The gunplay is so awesome, and the some of the things you can do with this game are like so unique. Like, you can almost every gun has very limited ammo, which I think is so. I mean, this is something that more games should do in the future. You don't go into a situation like this and have like infinite ammo. That's just not how it works. You pick up a gun and it might have like 10 bullets left in the clip because the opponent was firing at you. And so like they've used their bullets. Like, you don't have much left. So you pick up the gun, you might only get a few shots out of it. But then the genius thing that this game does is you have this empty gun. What can you do with it? You can throw it at your opponent to stun them. You can pick up a different gun and it flips up into your hand and is instantly fireable. There's like, you're encouraged to like constantly be dropping your weapons and picking up new weapons and trying out different things. And there's tons of environmental hazards everywhere. So you're encouraged to like shoot explosive barrels and shoot vents and shoot pipes and shoot support beams off of walkways and do all this stuff. And that part of the game is just so excellent. I mean, they could make an entire game that's just a third person shooter with those mechanics, and I would play it and love it. It was great. The AI in this game is really remarkably smart. I mean, it is kind of crazy. They will flank you. They do not care. You will die in this game on the normal difficulty. I played on the normal difficulty. I died a lot in firefights because they do not care. They will find ways to expose you. You have to constantly be on the move. At the beginning of the game, I was spending a lot of time just like ducking behind cover and like trying to pop out and shoot people because that's what you do in a lot of games in third person shooters. But you cannot do that in this game. They will rush you. They will throw grenades at you. They will force you out of cover. They will destroy your cover. They will do everything they can to get you. And you really have to stay moving in order to stay alive. And that all plays into the mechanics of the gunplay, because if you're moving, you're picking up new guns. So you're able to like stay active in combat and not run out of ammo and be able to, engage with the different parts of the environment. Whereas if you're stuck in one spot and you don't move, you'll run out of ammo very quickly and you won't be able to interact with the environment because you will run out of resources. Not just in your guns ammo capacity, but with your gadgets too, because your gadgets have very limited resources. You may only get one or two uses out of each gadget before you run out of gadget ammo effectively. And then you got to run around and get more. But I found that if you stay moving in combat, the gunplay specifically, the game just feels so good to play. I mean, the most fun I had with the game is when it opened up into those firefights and you just had the ability to run around and really engage with the mechanics of the game. There's a part that I remember specifically where like I picked up a gun off the ground, shot an explosive barrel underneath a walkway. The walkway dropped and killed a guy. There were these other guys that were like approaching me from another angle and trying to flank me. And so I had to run out of the cover that I was behind, run up to where I had just blown up this barrel. There was another gun sitting there. I threw my one gun at one of the opponents that was coming at me, picked up the gun of the guy that I had just killed off the catwalk, used that gun, threw it at another guy. As I threw it at him, it hit his face. His gun popped up into the air. Like he threw his gun up into the air because he got hit in the face by me throwing my gun at him. I picked his gun up out of the air and then shot him in the face with his own gun, which felt so cool. And like I just the stuff that like you can rush into somebody, like shoulder check somebody, and they'll like drop their gun, and you can literally pick it up as it's dropping and use it. And like the game just feels so fluid in these moments. It's really excellent. I think that they basically created a brand new third person shooter combat system in this game that they really should lean into because it's the best part of the game from a mechanical perspective. It is so fun to go into these combat sections, these gun combat sections, and there's so many different like ways you can approach these. I think that's the best part of the game by far. The stealth is like pretty meh. It's certainly not Hitman. I mean, the number of like quote disguises that you can put on in this game is like super limited, um, to the point where they're barely even there. The bluffing mechanic is cool from a writing perspective. Like to hear the way that Bond tries to get himself out of these situations is cool, but ultimately it's just you press a button and you get out of a situation and you have basically one use of it before you run out and you need to gather more of your quote bluffing energy or whatever it is. But a lot of the time it's just like, oh, I screwed up, let me bluff my way out of this, which is cool, but it doesn't have the same flavor as Hitman where you put on a disguise for certain areas of the map and that's your bluff basically. Like 47 doesn't really do much talking in the game, but the disguises really are a bluff mechanic in a way, and they replace those disguises with this, bluff thing in this game where Bond has to lie his way out of a situation, but it's not that mechanically deep. It's just kind of cool from a writing perspective, and it's in character for Bond, and I totally get that. Um, and the disguises thing is obviously much more of a Hitman thing, but uh, that's all just to say that the stealth gameplay is pretty limited. There are stealth portions of the game that felt better than others, but there are some that just felt like there was really no good way to do it. Or and more often than that, what would end up happening is I'd go into a situation with my poison gas gadget, which you get two charges of basically before it runs out. And I'd go into a room, poison two guys, go find more of the chemical ammo or whatever that you have to use to poison opponents, and then I'd go poison a couple more guys, go find more ammo, poison a couple more guys, and that was just the best way to get through almost every situation because the stealth is like pretty mechanically shallow otherwise. Um, and ultimately what I wanted most of the time was to get through the stealth section so that I could get to the big combat set piece section later where you had access to guns and you could engage with that portion of the game because again that portion of the game mechanically speaking is the most fun. So what I think I would like I want them to do one of two things for the sequel. I want them to either lean more into the Hitman style open playgrounds gameplay and sort of give us more of that because IO's insanely good at that gameplay style. Or I would like them to lean much more into the gunplay and fix the melee combat so that it feels a bit more mechanically tight and give us just a straight up really great action game. And if they do one of those two things, either one of those two things, I'm happy. But I think one of the problems with the game is they're trying to do too many things. I think they realized that they couldn't just strip the game completely of its Hitman DNA. So they had to include ostensibly some of that Hitman style gameplay, even though it's pretty shallow. but they also wanted to make like a big high budget action adventure game, and so those things conflict a lot of the time instead of complementing each other, um, which was a fear that I had for the game, and it ended up coming true. I think both sides of the game, both the story side and the open playground style, can be great, but they just don't mesh together that well. And so I want IO to either fix that balance in some way, figure out a way to integrate them better, or to just lean more into one or the other. I think they created a really great foundation. They created a really cool world with a great main character, a great supporting cast, some interesting, um, uh, backstory and lore, and some mysteries that are unsolved. And so they have like a great foundation for the story. And I think they made one of the coolest third person shooters to have come out in recent memory. I think it's just so excellent. Um, so they really could just make like a really great action game, but I think they're not going to abandon the Hitman DNA, and so I think they need to find ways to better integrate that into the game and make it so that it feels more like that open playground style that Hitman is. So that's my thoughts on the game. It's been almost an hour of me ranting about it. I think the game is excellent in most ways. It does have some mechanical drawbacks. I think the melee combat is not good. Um, I think some of the stealth stuff could use some refinement. I think the way that the game tries to integrate the missions into the story sometimes could use some work, but overall, it's definitely worth playing, especially if you're a fan of Uncharted, that style of kind of single player action adventure game. You'll have a great time with it. And I just hope that IO takes this and really learns from it. I mean, I totally trust them. They took Hitman 1, which was like a kind of interesting concept of a game, and they turned it into the Hitman trilogy, which is one of my absolute favorite games ever. It's just so mechanically dense and there's so much to it. It's so excellent. So I hope they do the same thing with 007. We know we're getting a sequel, it's confirmed already. So yeah, I just hope that they learn some lessons from this game and make something even better next time. So hopefully, instead of kind of an 8 out of 10 game, we'll get a 9 out of 10 game. And then maybe by the time they do the full trilogy, it'll be a 10 out of 10, just like Hitman. So that's my thoughts on the game. Thanks for listening to me rant about it for almost an hour at this point. And yeah, check the game out. Again, if you are not 100% sure, feel free to wait for a sale. I think that's totally fine. The game has already sold really well. And, if you're just kind of waiting to see how the game evolves, I think that's a completely fair way to go about it. If I wasn't sure about the game, I would certainly say waiting for a sale is appropriate. But otherwise, guys, thanks so much for watching the video and listening to me rant about this video game, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.